Welcome, everybody, to the Paranormal View right here on the ParaX Radio Network. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening tonight and being here. We got a great show lined up. And for those that are listening from around the world, if you are not here with us in the ParaX chat room, you can do so. Come over to para-x.com and you can sign in and listen to the show. And you'll be able to private chat me or Craig Rupp with questions for our guest tonight. I do have Craig Rupp with us tonight.
Hello, everybody.
And got Jeffrey Gould with us tonight.
Hello, hello.
But Jeffrey is outside on a phone, so he's not in the chat room. But we do have Craig, so you can either private message either Craig or myself with questions, and I'm sure you probably will have quite a few for our guest tonight. We're looking forward to the show. Ought to be really interesting. So, Jeff, you've got all the introductions. Why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest?
Yes, I do. And let me just explain why I'm on the phone so that people understand why they're going to hear weird sounds like cars and stuff. As an actor, I've got a student film shoot that got moved to tonight, and I told them, well, I need to, co-host my show. So my ride is actually going to get here in about an hour or 70 to 75 minutes and start driving me. So you may hear, hopefully, not too much background noise. Regarding tonight, of course, our guest is Thomas P. Fusco, who's an independent researcher who's devoted nearly 3 decades investigating the relationship between mind, physics, spirituality, parapsychology, scientific anomalies, and paranormal phenomena, and with the goal of uncovering the unifying cosmological framework that's eluded mankind for generations. He's been invited to speak as a guest on numerous radio programs, including our own Dave here at the ParaX. With his single super geometrical model, he explains the physical, observable characteristics of every primary and secondary phenomenon associated with paranormal and psychic phenomenon, as well as shedding light on a number of scientific, astrophysical, and quantum physical enigmas. Rather than explaining the paranormal with quantum physics, as everyone else is doing, Tom Fusco provides the proof for the opposite case, namely that it's the quantum physics that's paranormal, spooky actions at a distance indeed. So Mr. Fusco here will be discussing the theory of his supergeometry presented in his book, Behind the Cosmic Veil, a new vision of reality that describes a new model for the supernatural mechanics, which not only explains the behavior of strange phenomena like the paranormal and UFOs, but also provides compelling answers to some of the fundamental problems facing physics today. So welcome, Tom Fusco.
Yes, welcome.
Hi,
Tom.
how's it going, guys?
Welcome. Good.
Great.
Excited
to be back on the ParaX network.
Well, that's great, and we're excited to have you back with us. Where are you from?
I hail right now out of Ocala, Florida.
Ocala, Florida. That's not a bad place. I used to live in Daytona many, many years ago.
Oh, yeah, that's not too far from here.
No, it's not too far. No. Getting started, though, what actually got you started in the direction to write this book? What behind the cosmic veil, and what is behind the cosmic veil?
Well, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. In other words, the title of the book indicates that there are quite a few mysteries that we observe and experience in our universe and in our world around us, that the standard model of reality based on science doesn't really provide any answers for. And yet these things do exist. So for me, it's kind of like a veil of reality. And in order to find the secrets to that, we have to peek behind the cosmic veil. As far as my experiences, I had a several what you might call psychic or supernatural experiences in my teenage years, in my early 20s, that caused me to question the nature of reality as I was taught it. I was very scientifically minded and also very pragmatic, pretty much with a blue-collar upbringing. So it was something where, for me, I needed to find what the reasons were, what the causes were for these things.
So by psychic experience, you're referring to the artwork you observed and suddenly had a sense of the artist having his own physical experience with his arm?
Yeah, you're talking about that experience I mentioned in my book, where I was a sophomore in high school, and a freshman girl that I had just met about a week before had invited me over to her folks' house for lunch. And while I was in the living room waiting for her to make sandwiches in the kitchen, I was looking around the artwork on the wall, and I came to one picture, one painting, and I felt a severe pain in my left arm as I was looking at it. And when she came back in the room, I had asked her, did the person who painted this painting ever injure their arm? And of course, I didn't know anything about her family or whether it was a crazy idea to even ask anybody if they personally knew the person who painted the painting that was on the wall. She just about turned white. And she had told me that it was actually her older brother who had painted the painting some years before. And during the period of time that he was working on it, he was out in the back yard working with a chainsaw, and he did indeed severely injure his left arm with that chainsaw. And, of course, once you have an experience like that, it's not too easy to just brush it off or dismiss it. So that really got me thinking, and that's kind of what started setting me on the track that led to the book.
So, do you consider yourself a paranormal investigator?
Actually, no. I consider myself a theorist.
Okay.
I myself don't conduct paranormal investigations. I've actually never been on a paranormal investigation. But I do accept the evidence that people are gathering in those investigations. And so I just accept those pieces of evidence and have used them in my reckoning.
Now, I just want to remind everybody again, if you do have questions for Tom, you can send a private message to either Craig Rupp or myself, and we'll get those questions right over to him.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I really liked about the book is how it's structured, that it's searching for as well as defining the theory of everything, or as you call it, TOE. Do you actually call it TOE or just TOE?
Well, it depends on how you want to paraphrase it. I call it by its initials. I'm sure there's people out there that call it TOE. It's a standard terminology in physics.
Yeah. And you indicate that essentially you're creating the beginnings of understanding not only the physical world in which we're living, but the quantum aspects as well as what we perceive almost peripherally as what we call the paranormal. And so maybe you can explain exactly what exactly is supergeometry and how you came to formulate it.
Well, supergeometry, the idea behind that is that there is a body of information, a structure, a matrix. It's gone by many different names in the past, that exists outside of space-time, outside of our four-dimensional realm, but is actually a part of a greater reality in which our four-dimensional space-time is only a part. And we can't see this information. All we can do is see the evidence of it. And it goes by, as I said, it goes by many names. It goes all the way back to Plato's Forms, which was the same kind of concept. It's been called cosmic consciousness, universal mind. In the Bible, it's called the wisdom of God or the Word of God. It's the same kind of a concept, the Christian logos. In physics, probably no one said it better than physicist David Bohm, who was one of the most influential physicists of the 20th century. And he called it implicate order. And he said that implicate order resided outside of physical space-time, but gave rise to what he called explicate order, which was the universe of space and time that we, experience with our senses. So what I wanted to do was to give it a name that was not only scientifically consistent, but it was also tangible in some way. So most people understand what geometry is. That's something that's very tangible, and it's not as ambiguous as kind of the idea of information. And anytime science talks about a superset of another structure or another process, they use that prefix super. So I thought that the name supergeometry would be the best way to express that superphysical structure that exists over and outside of space-time.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book about the idea that there seem to be elements that exist outside of space-time. I once, many years ago, I took one of these self-help seminar thingies, and he had indicated that apparently at the Big Bang, there were like a multitude of dimensions, and that all of a sudden, all but about 17 winked out of existence, or at least outside our perception. So that always blew my mind that there was something, beyond what we're able to perceive, that there is stuff there, we just can't perceive it. It's outside our understanding and comprehension.
Yes, and one of the paradigm shifts that I've tried to introduce was to kind of get away from some of the traditional ways of looking at things. We tend to, even when we're talking about things that are outside of the physical, something that we might call superphysical or the other side, or we could even talk about it as a spiritual realm, that type of thing. We tend to think about these things in terms of what is physical. And that's where we get very confused. For example, the idea of multiple dimensions or other dimensions. What I've done is that I say that that's not really accurate. That's not a good way of talking about it, because dimensions are something that are measurable. And what's outside of space-time is not measurable in a conventional sense. So by definition, they cannot be dimensions. And so when we start talking about other dimensions or outside or extra dimensions, we begin to walk down a mental path that we find is pretty much a conceptual dead end, because we're trying to attribute physical qualities to that which is not physical.
So, I'm not even sure where to go with that. You had indicated how quantum physics is itself essentially paranormal compared to science in general. I remember in one of our earliest emails, I mentioned studying the holographic universe model, which I always found fascinating, because a friend of mine always had the joke that in a holographic universe, an umbrella would actually stop a boulder from landing on Wile E. Coyote. So, but essentially that, because you even bring up how being the observer always changes, almost changes reality, especially like certainly be trying to measure a proton. You can only measure its speed or its mass, but you can't do both. And things like that always kind of blew my mind when I was growing up.
Well, yeah, and it's a very good point. We tend to today try to explain the paranormal in terms of quantum physics. And as you said, Jeff, what I typically have done here have taken the opposite point of view in that quantum physics is essentially paranormal in itself. But in order to make that step, one of the first things that I found early in my work is that I had to come up with a very specific and scientifically reasonable and consistent definition for what is paranormal. We've so often used it as this kind of a catch-all phrase that anything that's weird or strange or unusual or inexplainable is tossed into this category called the paranormal. And this is where we have trouble because we need some solid foundation. So ultimately what I did was came upon a definition for the paranormal that says that it is an event, it is an observation that is physically observable, that has an effect on its surrounding environment. It interacts with the physical environment, but has no direct physical cause connected to it. So, for example, we're all talking this evening. Everybody can hear our voices. Our voices are normal. They are vocal cords that are vibrating the air molecules at a particular frequency and amplitude, and those waves are carried to our ears, in this case through electrical devices, but it's still, the origins are still normal, where the vibrating air hits our ears and we hear the voice. Well, what makes a disembodied voice paranormal is not the voice itself. All of that is exactly the same as standard physics. The difference is that there is no direct physical cause, like a set of vocal cords, connected to and local to the effect. There's just the effect with no physical cause present in the same vicinity. And that's what physicists call non-local causality. As one author put it, it's like getting a black eye in Miami from a punch that's thrown in Cleveland. I was always very fond of that metaphor. But when we take that definition, which is a scientific definition, we find that when we look at some of the aspects of quantum physics, we see the exact same things going on. We see physical effects that interact with their surroundings, but no direct physical cause connected to that effect. And so once we adopt that definition for the paranormal, not only does it give us a firm foundation from which to reason, so to speak, putting a solid stake in the ground, but it also blurs the lines between these different disciplines. So when we look at these effects in quantum physics, I say, based on my definition, that it's like what you said, quantum physics is paranormal.
So now, I noticed you talk in your book about, well, I'll just ask the question, what is the divine order of the cosmos?
Yes. Now, that relates back to what I was talking about with supergeometry, is that there are certain observations that we have in the universe that are not explainable in a material way. And I'll try to elaborate on that. One of the problems that physicists and physics has and has confronted in recent decades, we have discovered enough about the universe and the observations that we find in it, and have accomplished so much in our basic physics that we have reached a point to where we are literally running out of material to explain all the observations that we see in the universe. Physics is a material science. It is the ultimate materialism. And so the goal of physics, in a sense, is to explain everything physical with everything physical. In other words, the universe should be self-explanatory. Everything that's physical should have a physical cause and effect. It should be self-contained. But we've reached a point to where we've literally run out of physical material to explain everything that we see. And so, since the universe is an orderly place, we have to understand that there is some sort of an order that is existing beyond material. Now, physicists, of course, physicists won't accept that until they reach an impasse, and they ultimately know that they can't go any farther with the materialistic view. But all indications are that there is some sort of an order that is apart from and aside from and above from what is material. And that's what I call as being understood as divine order.
Now,
I was actually impressed by your new system of paranormal investigation, redefining rather quite accurately, actually, various concepts of science and paranormal in general. I know that you tended to go more with the prefix trans, which does actually make more sense in a scientific sounding than just saying, clairaudience and but transmutation and various definitions like that work out pretty well.
Yes, I took a long time working on that because my premise was this. Here's one of the problems in investigating the paranormal, or at least in understanding it. And by the paranormal, I'm talking more specifically right now, the haunted house style paranormal. We see all these different observations. We see apparitions. We hear disembodied voices. We get EVPs. We have malfunction of electrical equipment. People are actually attacked sometimes. We see these cold spots. We see these spikes in electromagnetic fields. All these different kinds of phenomena. And yet we have no concept to connect them together. We have no idea why they're interrelated. And one of the problems which clouds our thinking is actually that the very terminology that we use draws us into a separate direction with each different kind of phenomena. So just think about it. Think for a second about EVP, and then you're going to have a train of thought that goes specifically in that direction and doesn't touch on anything else. If you think about apparitions, then you're going to have a train of thought that goes in that direction, and you've lost the connection with a cold spot or an electromagnetic field. So one of the things that I felt we needed to do was to come up with a new way of classifying all this phenomena that was not only consistent within itself, but also illustrative of what type of mechanism might be behind them. So, for example, as you know, Jeff, what I've come up with is a handful of categories. The first one is transmentation. And that transmental phenomena is all the type of psychic phenomena, the mental phenomena. Then you have translocational phenomena. Translocations are when physical substances, matter or energy, are actually displaced through a means that is other than physical, through a means that is not physically local at the place of that effect. That's a translocational phenomenon. Then we have a transmigrational phenomenon. And transmigrational is like a levitation, telekinesis. These types of phenomena would fall under transmigrational. And you can see already when we start looking at it this way, we begin to draw together phenomena that have similar characteristics instead of going down an individual dead-end road for each particular type of manifestation. Then there's transmutational phenomena where the actual substance, the physical substance that's in question, actually changes its basic nature, its molecular structure on some level. And then the other one is synchronicity. Carl Jung came up with that It's a great term. I couldn't come up with anything better than that. And so with these 5 categories, we could literally plug every type of supernatural phenomena that we observe anywhere, be it paranormal, quantum physics, religious, spiritual. We can plug all of those into one of these 5 categories and begin to make sense out of all this.
Now, I want to take a couple of minutes here because it's right at break time, and I guess which one of you guys be doing it first, Jeff or
Me.
Craig
All
can
right,
do
Craig
it
does. Okay.
first, as always.
I do
Hey,
want.
I talk.
I do want to remind everybody, if you're not over here in the ParaX chat room, to come over to para-x.com and join in with all these wonderful people. You'll be able to ask private message Craig or myself with questions for Tom. And you'll enjoy all the wonderful people that's in here with their conversations and be able to interact with everybody. When we come back, of course, we got tons and tons of different stuff to actually talk about. So we'll probably be gone about, 6-7 minutes, give everybody a chance to stretch your legs and all. So
I should ask Craig, have you figured whether or not you can say supergeometry yet?
Super geometry. How's that?
There you go. In the email, you weren't sure you could pronounce that. I was amazed.
I just did.
There you go. All right.
Okay.
All right, everybody. You're listening to the Paranormal View on the ParaX Radio Network. We'll be right back. Enjoy the music.
Whether you're listening at home, at work, or anywhere, thanks for making ParaX part of your day. Your source for everything paranormal, ParaX.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Paranormal View right here on the ParaX Radio Network. Want to thank everybody for listening, no matter where you are from around the world. And if you're not here with us, please come over to para-x.com and join in with all these wonderful people. You'll also be able to private message either Craig or myself with questions for our wonderful guest, Tom. And we have a chat room full, and we have a whole lot of people listening from around the world. And I appreciate each and every one of you for being here this week. We got more to talk about tonight with Tom Fusco. We're going to be talking some about gravity a little later. We're going to talk about some dimensions, and we're going to talk about UFOs, and we probably won't be able to get everything in that we want to talk about, but we're going to try. So with that, welcome back, Tom.
Thanks for having me, guys.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about just for a few minutes, spirits and energy. Do you think that spirits already have their kind of energy and they don't need ours to speak or move things and etc.?
Well, yes and no. And I'll explain what I mean. If you remember, I was talking a few minutes before about one of the ways that we get confused is by confusing physical and non-physical, or what I call superphysical elements, and trying to look at what's superphysical and speak about it in physical terms. So, for example, from every evidence that we can gather in any type of an observation that we might interpret anyway in a spirit, so to speak, these spirits are not physical. Whatever they are, they don't dwell within normal space-time. Otherwise, the evidence for them would be always there. They pass in and out of the realm of space and time. Now, here's the problem. When you talk about energy, I know it's common for people to think about physical objects as physical, but energy is physical also. Matter and energy are both physical things. And so when I hear the term spirit energy, I think of it in terms of an oxymoron. It's like saying honest politician. That, energy is physical and spirits are not. So spirits do not have energy. But there are ways in which they can interact with the environment that makes it appear as if energy is being generated. And I think that we're going to get into that a little bit later.
Good. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for that.
Well, you had indicated with the revised system, with the 5 definitions and synchronicity, which was already there, that it brought up the distinctions that people, like you say, that people think of the other realm, parallel dimensions, and spirit worlds. I'm a science fiction nerd. I love Doctor Who and everything. So for me, I already knew like the 4th dimension is time. But you indicated that there's 4 distinct superphysical and paraphysical principles from your revised system that for clarification. Maybe you could mention some of those.
Yeah, and those are the principles on which, in part, my new terminology is based upon. And what I say is, look, in paranormal phenomena, there are various things that we observe. We observe things that appear and disappear outside of space-time. We observe things that are moved or displaced with no physical cause present. We have also observed on rare occasions things where the actual physical qualities of an object have actually been mutated, in a sense, from a source that's not physical. And then we see instances where events that apparently are not related in the physical seem to become synchronized, which is like what Carl Jung talked about with synchronicity. So these 4 principles, that things can be moved and translocated, so to speak, by a non-physical source, that things can be mutated, that their nature can be changed by a non-physical source, that things can pass in and out of physical reality without any physical mechanism on this side being present, and seemingly unrelated events can be synchronized so that apparently there is something that's outside of the physical universe that are connecting these events together that we can't see. Those are what I call basically the 4 paraphysical principles. They're the characteristics of observations that we call paranormal.
Yeah. So somehow I thought that was a comma. Sorry, I didn't realize that. At the end of the sentence,
I'm supposed to take pauses every once in a while just to make sure that I'm doing a monologue.
Well, we don't actually mind monologues. In fact, when you had indicated your model of bilocation, I was very amused because you had the same toy I had as a kid, with the little blank face guy with the iron filings and the magnet.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah, my brother and I each had one of those back when I was growing up. And as my mother would say, "Little things please little minds." In the 60s, that was high tech compared to like what's out there today. You try and give that to a 6-year-old, they're like, "What is this?" They'd be like, wouldn't know what to do with it.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that because in trying to express that particular model about that little toy in the iron filings, I came up with a thought experiment that works a lot better on the radio. And I guess we could talk about it a little bit and see what people think about this.
Yeah.
Imagine you had a bowl that was filled with water up to the top. And imagine that bowl, the water inside of there, represents what I'm talking about in terms of supergeometry. It is pre-material or supermaterial, superphysical information, whatever substances might be there. We wouldn't be able to call them material. But all that stuff that supposedly is on the other side, let's consider that as the water. And the bowl is filled to the top. Now, let's say we take a rubber fabric, a rubber membrane, and, you know, it's flexible, it's stretchable, it's featureless. But let's also imagine that it has a bunch of little holes in it. Not that you can see them, they're very fine, but the holes are big enough to allow water through them. And then let's take this membrane and stretch it over the mouth of this bowl, the top of this bowl. So when we look down upon it, all we can see is the rubber membrane, but we can't see any of the material and stuff that's going on behind it. We can't see the water. And let's figure that this rubber membrane is the fabric of space-time. This is actually the background fabric of our physical universe. Now, when we look at it as it is, it's featureless. There's no features in it whatsoever. But if you take your finger, imagine taking your finger and pushing it down into that rubber membrane. What you're going to create is a pocket in space-time, a depression, if you will. Now, as you push that down, the water will come in and flow through those holes and pool at the bottom of that depression. And that's a model of materialization. We have actually materialized something from the other side by bending the fabric of space-time. So we see this puddle of water, it materialized. Now, if you pull your finger back up, the water disappears, the pocket disappears. You just witnessed a dematerialization. Take two fingers, push them down in two different places. The identical puddle appears at the bottom of both depressions. You just saw a manifestation of bilocation. Now, let's take a finger, push it down in there, and slide it across the rubber while it's pushed down in it. And you'll see the puddle of water magically move with the finger. Remember, you can't see the pocket of space underneath of it. All you see is the water as the object. You just saw a levitation. And so that's a good thought experiment to get people thinking in the right direction as to what's going on.
That also brings to mind the concept of where might we be able to find those rifts through which the water would come?
Well, that's a good question. My argument, of course, is that is what I'm describing as part of the model of what I call paranormal mechanics.
Yeah. And I really... Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say it's very similar to how gravity was demonstrated on like some of the old science programs, where they'd have almost like a waterbed of the black line with the sort of the holodeck crosshairs, and they would roll balls on it to demonstrate how smaller balls will go to the larger balls, and this is creating a deeper depression in like you say, the fabric of space-time.
Exactly. The difference, though, is that there are problems with our understanding of gravity. And gravity is, to me, one of the keys. Understanding what we don't know about gravity was one of the keys for me to unlock the mystery behind the paranormal. And I'll explain to you what I mean. I was talking in the chat room earlier about gravity being the elephant in the room. When we were in school, we were taught all kinds of things about gravity. But what we were taught was all about gravitational effect. We were talking about a physical effect that interacted with its surroundings. Starting to sound familiar already.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, in order for it to be a physical cause, we need a particle that propagates as a wave. In other words, the conventional model of gravity is that it is a force. And if it's a force, like electromagnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces, it would require a particle that conveys that force by propagating itself as a wave. This is how it works in physics. Unfortunately, after decades and decades of diligent research with all types of different methods, we have never succeeded in finding a graviton, nor have we ever measured a wave of gravity. It's as if they don't exist at all. And so gravity is this mysterious stuff that, for example, we were taught gravity holds the moon in orbit around the Earth. But when you stop and think about it, to the best of our knowledge, there is nothing physical that connects the Earth to the moon. There is no physical connection. It's just hung there by this strange effect. We don't really know what gravity is yet. We know what it does, but we don't know what it is.
Well, now,
so here's an example of Einstein's spooky action at a distance. Interesting that he used that particular word, spooky. Now, if we take this a step further and think about gravity somewhat, when Einstein was working on his relativity theories, one of the foundations for the concepts which led him to the understanding of relativity was what he called a unified field. He thought that at one point in time that everything in the universe consisted of one field. And that field split up and diversified. And he wanted to mathematically gather all that together in a single equation to represent this field. To Einstein, particles of matter were actually the same thing as the substance of space, but were only locations where that substance of space was highly dense. He actually called particles matter points. And this is where he got the idea that matter and energy were just two different forms of the same thing. But the problem that Einstein had with the unified field theory is that he could not express gravity mathematically in 4 dimensions, 3 spatial and 1 temporal. And since then, with our 2 major systems by which we understand the universe, relativity and quantum physics, any attempt to try to reconcile this comes up with the same obstacle, gravity. When we try to come up with a material explanation for the universe, we come up with the same problem that stops us from achieving that, gravity. Here's another example, and everybody will remember this from school. We were all taught that gravity was the force that assembled the universe. It drew the cosmic particles in one place and made them form stars and planets and solar systems and galaxies and all that. Then we sat there like logs in a chair, listened to them while they told us that the source of gravity is mass that's generated from galaxies, stars, solar systems, and planets. So how did that substance exist before the materials or the objects were created that generate it? That's the elephant in the room. Yep. Physicists know this, but this is what they would call a trade secret.
Every so often I come across these lists. There's a site called crack.com which lists all sorts of weird and unusual stuff, and one of the things they said was stuff that can't even really be explained by science yet, including how a bicycle rides in real life. They can't understand the gyroscopic concepts as to why a bicycle doesn't fall down. But one of the things the list pointed out was that we know what gravity is, we know what it does, but we can't explain it. There's no, and even Isaac Asimov in his one of his science books I remember pointing out that gravity was one of not only the strongest forces, but also one of the weakest, because a toy magnet can lift a pin off a table with the entire mass of the planet pulling against it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it definitely is. Gravity is paranormal. I'll give you another example. In recent decades, we have made enough observations in the universe now to come to the understanding that there's about 90% more gravitational lensing in the universe than there is adjacent physical mass to produce it. We've got about a 90% deficit of mass to explain all the gravity. And this is where physicists have come up with this imaginary dark matter. This goes back to what I was talking about, where physics is literally running out of material to explain everything that they observe. And so, unable to accept the Theodore Kalusin concept that gravity is non-local, that the source of gravity is outside of space-time, they had to make up this imaginary material that they call dark matter. But there's absolutely no evidence for its existence whatsoever, other than the fact that we have an observation for which we need desperately a material explanation, and we have none. So once again, we come back to gravity. The universe is a very unusually ordered place. The orderly state of the universe is highly, highly improbable, and it goes against all the physical laws that we know. Take a box of air. Think about a sealed box of air made out of glass, for example. Air comprises of a lot of molecules, different types of gases, and the molecules are bouncing against each other all the time. It's in a state of disorder and chaos, because anytime any kind of an order or structure begins to appear, the collision of all the atoms and molecules destroys it. This is the most probable state of existence, which is disorder. Now imagine if every oxygen atom in that box of air suddenly began to collect for no inexplicable reason, for no apparent reason whatsoever. All the oxygen atoms collect and form a pocket in one corner of the box. Now we have order, and now we have structure. But darn it if we have any idea how that could possibly ever occur by nature. And yet that's exactly what the universe did. There was this cosmic cloud that suddenly began to draw order. And atoms and molecules everywhere in the universe began to assemble themselves according to the same order. It wasn't like particles assembled and disassembled and retried like some evolutionary process. They all began to assemble everywhere in the universe at once. And how did they collect in one place? Gravity. So we keep coming back to this fact that gravity is probably the most paranormal thing that we know of. And I'll talk about, I'm going to take a breath for a second. I'm going to want to talk later on about how gravity helps us explain the paranormal.
Great. That'll be good.
I was going to, before we go to break, I just wanted to point out that it's very close to something else you touched on in the book that blew my mind. Was you're pointing out, like you say, that order came almost out of nowhere, out of chaos. That one of the things that got me was your, I wrote it down just to make sure I said it right. Yeah, you touched on stuff that I used to ponder about as a kid, but there was no explanation for, like how do flowers know how to create pollen that specific insects are going to come along and move from one place to another, and how do the insects know to do that, and the different aspects of what most people just say, well, it's evolution, but if it was just trial and error, we would have much more extinctions than unless they took these evolutionary leaps out of nowhere. And that always,
You're right.
when I was a kid, yeah.
Yes. Everywhere we look in the universe, we have learned enough now, and our powers of observation and our instrumentation is good enough now to see observations that we have no material explanation for. In past centuries, our observations were so limited that it was easy to find the material explanation. So science rode that particular horse and kept riding it and saying, there's never going to be an end to this. It was like the real estate boom. They kept riding that horse, but now they've reached a point where they've solved all the simple problems. They've observed all these other phenomena in the universe, and they just simply have nothing left in the material bank account to explain it.
Just for grins and giggles, Pat put a question in the chat room, and he wanted to know if you solved the problem of where does the missing sock go to?
The missing sock.
Yeah,
That's by location.
anytime you do laundry, you always come up with a sock missing.
Oh. Well, supposedly, I never handled that question specifically, but for those who believe in that odd multiverse concept, you're very, your double in the other universe opens up his drawer and finds an extra one.
Ah, which we're going to be talking somewhat about the different universes too in a little bit. We got lots more to do and talk about. I think what we'll do is we're going to take another a break, let everybody kind of like rest their vocal cords and run to the restroom and get you something to drink or whatever you need to do. Great show tonight. I want to thank Tom for being with us, and I want to thank all those that's in the chat room and all those that are listening from around the world. If you're not here with us in the chat room, come over to para-x.com and you'll be able to private message us with questions and join in all the chatter in the chat room. Jeff, why don't you take us out? We'll take another 7-8 minute break, something like that, and let everybody kind of relax a minute.
Yeah, well, you're all listening to the Paranormal View on para-x.com. My ride hasn't arrived yet, but stay tuned after this musical interlude for more enthralling information from our guest, Thomas Fusco, and the author of Behind the Cosmic Veil.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Paranormal View right here on the Para-X Radio Network. Want to thank everybody for being here tonight. We've got a great guest. We want to get right back to him because we have lots more questions and lots more to talk about before the show is over, and it will go by fairly fast, I'm sure. So I want to welcome Tom back to the show, Tom Fusco. Are you still here?
Oh, yeah, I just come back from checking. I got all my socks.
All right. Now, I guess, Craig, are you with us?
I am here, and I do have a question.
I figured you had a question, so I think what we'll do is we'll lead right in and let you get started on that. How's that sound?
Sounds good. Amazing things do happen. Tom, now, what is dark matter and how does it relate to the paranormal? Now, is that like a lot of these places people see shadow figures? Is that what you refer to as dark matter?
Actually, no. I consider dark matter to be a completely fantasy substance. There's nothing to dark matter except that it illustrates.
They're just trying to. So essentially, dark matter is just trying to fill in their equation as to why there's more gravity than mass, observable mass. That is.
Absolutely, they had to come up with a material explanation. Now think about this, okay? Here's this dark matter. We can't see it. We can't measure it in any way. They can't even find any kind of trace in it in that Large Hadron Collider that they're running over there in Europe. And yet, this particle is supposed to be so massive. And when I say massive, I'm speaking from a physical point of view. Massive. It's so massive that it generates about 90% of the gravity in the universe. And yet we can't measure it or see it in any way. Give me a break.
Wow.
It just doesn't exist in my book. But what we have, you heard a little bit earlier, I mentioned something about Theodore Kaluza. Theodore Kaluza, he was working with Einstein on trying to come up with this equation for the unified field theory. And he decided one day to just make up an imaginary coordinate outside of space-time. And he didn't know what it represented. It just represented something that was outside of the 4 dimensions that they were struggling with. And he included a value to it, worked Einstein's equations. At the end, he subtracted out that non-physical element, and lo and behold, he balanced Einstein's equations. He's the only living human being that's ever done it. And he used this kind of technique. And towards the end of his career, he came to the conclusion that gravity is non-local. In other words, that the cause of gravity is not mass, but something that exists outside of space-time. And that mass is sometimes associated with gravity. So when we see these bands of gravitational lensing out in the universe, which means that they can see great expanses in the universe where the light that is coming from beyond it is actually bent around these expanses. So they know there's a gravitational field there. There's no adjacent mass. There's nothing but vacuum. And so the thing that has to do with the shadow ghosts I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But if you want, I would like to get into some of the meat and potatoes of how gravity relates to the paranormal, if that's okay.
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
Oh yeah, go.
All right,
go
good.
for it.
I'm always worried about talking too much.
Oh no,
know?
you can't do that. That's just
Okay,
fewer
good.
questions that we have to ask.
Here we go. Einstein demonstrated, and it was proved, that curvatures of space are always associated with gravity. Gravity bends space. The bending of space is associated with the gravitational effect. Now, if the premise is correct that this bending of space is influenced by something outside of space-time, how would that relate to what we see in a haunted house? So let's take this gravity inside of a haunted house and picture that you would have an expanding bubble of space-time where something is actually twisting and warping and bending the fabric of space. Now, we would have a couple effects that would occur in our field, so to speak, in our vicinity, because we have material that's present everywhere. Out in space, it's vacuum. But in a haunted house, you have building materials, you have atmosphere, you have oxygen, hydrogen, all those gases, and you have thermal energy, too, that's held within these materials. So the first thing that would happen if a bubble of space-time began to open in a haunted house is it would compress the molecules around it as that space was crushed in its immediate vicinity. You could imagine if you had a tub of very thick grease, like axle grease, and you pushed a ball inside of it, you would see the immediate area surrounding the ball where the grease was crushed and compressed. Now, what that mechanical pressure would do is that it would excite the molecules in the air surrounding it. And when that happens, the electrons in the atoms will jump up into their higher orbits. And as they jump up into those higher orbits, you're going to get an electromagnetic field. So paranormal investigators, they take these EMF meters into these haunted houses, and they see this rise in electromagnetic field coming from nowhere. There's no physical mechanism causing the field. It just appears. And I had one fella, the head of one investigative group, he said that you can almost predict that a paranormal effect is going to occur by watching what that EMF meter does. So that's one effect that we would have, an electromagnetic field. One of the things that would also happen is when that excitement of those atoms was expended, the electrons would drop back down. They would return back to their lower orbits. But when they do, they're going to release that excess energy in a couple different forms. One of the things that electrons can do is that they emit photons when they drop back down into their lower orbits. We still don't fully understand how that happens, how an electron can emit a photon and yet in itself not change anything about its structure, its nature, or its energy level. The photon just appears. And we have an example of that effect all around us. Pass an electromagnetic field through a particular form of material and excite the electrons, and when they drop back down, they emit photons, they emit light. That's what's called an LED. It's a light-emitting diode. So we would have the same kind of effect on occasions in a paranormal event with the expanding of space-time. Another thing that these electrons can do is emit heat. So here we have thermal energy that could be being emitted at the very outer edge of this expanding bubble of space. Now, this is interesting because we know that paranormal investigators have taken thermal imaging cameras into these haunted houses and on occasion have picked up paranormal images, sometimes apparitions in great detail. But when you study those paranormal heat signatures, you'll notice something strange about them. They don't look like an image of a living being, where you have great contrast between, like if you look at the face, you'll see great contrast in areas where they're white hot, and then the tips of the nose are almost blue, cold, or the tips of the ears where the circulation is poorer. And you look at the clothing, there's a great contrast between the signature of the flesh and the clothing. But when you look at these paranormal images, the heat signature is more or less uniform across the entire image. And that means that that image is being generated at the surface, at whatever that apparition is. There is no heat generating mechanism in the core of an apparition. It's happening uniformly over the surface. So that would be another manifestation that would be consistent with this idea of the expanding of space in a given location. Now, that's what we would see at the leading edge. Another thing that we would see is when that electromagnetic frequency hit a certain oscillation, it would begin to affect the electrical equipment in its immediate vicinity. We already know that effect. We've actually built weapons based on that. One of our greatest fears is that the sun, during an event, will give off an electromagnetic pulse that will shut down our electronics here on Earth.
Right.
But the funny thing is, here's what our problem is in the paranormal field in investigating. All these different events, we only have one thing mentally that we connect them all with, and that's with a spirit. So we start thinking about, oh, the spirit's doing this, the spirit's doing that. And they may very well be doing that, but we're missing what's happening in between. It's not a question of who's doing it, it's a question of how they're doing it, which we haven't answered. So, for example, if we go over to another field of the paranormal, traditionally said as paranormal, UFOs, we see the exact same phenomena. that in the vicinity of UFOs, suddenly all batteries go dead, the cars stop, radios don't work, flashlights don't work. But nobody would ever stop and say, oh, well, gee, the UFO is draining batteries out of my flashlight in order to physically manifest. Why? Because they're not thinking of a ghost. And so here we have, in paranormal events, the measurement of electronic fields coupled with the malfunction of electrical instruments. The relation between one and the other is so obvious almost a child would recognize it, and yet we can't see it because we got the ghost stuck in our head. Actually, the physics for that mechanism, where they say the spirits are draining energy or making cold spots in order to physically manifest, it simply isn't there. The physics isn't there for it. It's loosely associated with Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Matter and energy can be converted from one form to the other. But what we ignore, because we have the ghost in our head, is the part of the formula that says how much energy it would actually take to make a material object, even a tiny speck of it. And what we find in physics is that the entire energy output of the sun is not sufficient to make a single hamburger.
Wow.
And that's a scientific fact based on Einstein's equations. So the reality of it is that no, if a ghost was somehow, if old Uncle Fred died and somehow acquired through death the strange, uncanny ability to transmute energy directly into matter, however that could happen, we wouldn't be talking about areas of 2 or 3 feet around that drop 10 or 30 degrees. We'd be talking about how many square miles just dropped to negative 273 degrees centigrade. Absolute zero. Everything in the town frozen solid to make just the tiniest fraction of a second wisp of cigarette smoky type matter. It's just not there. So there has to be another explanation, and the very electromagnetic fields that they measure would explain exactly what's going on with the equipment if they understood it enough to bring in the oscilloscopes to be able to show that when it hits a certain frequency, that's when the electrical equipment begins to malfunction. So that's part of it there. Now, if we have an expanding outside edge, we also have an interior to this bubble. What would happen in the interior? Well, if it happened in the presence of matter, not in the vacuum of space, but in the presence of matter, a couple things would occur. You would essentially have a thermal and material vacuum inside of that bubble. If it opened up very, very slowly, the laws of equilibrium would be at work, and that the material from the surrounding area, the air molecules and the thermal energy within them, would flow into that vacuum very smoothly, very gracefully, very quickly, like water seeking its own level. We wouldn't be able to detect any variation there. But if it happened real quick, imagine walking in from inside your house to your front door on a cold winter's day and open the door suddenly. You're going to get a vacuum created. You're going to get this big inrush of cold. And so when this bubble expands rapidly, more so than the surrounding thermal and material is able to quickly fill that vacuum in, you're going to have a couple things. You're going to have a cold spot. It's going to only exist temporarily, but suddenly a spot gets cold, and then it stops. It equalizes, and the temperature comes back to normal. Another thing that's going to happen, if it happens very quickly, you're going to have an inrushing of air. And this would explain the mystery breezes that people feel, where they feel a breeze whisk right by with no doors or windows open. Another effect that it would have is this. I don't know how many people have told me that when they go into a haunted house and it's active, one of the things that they all report is a feeling of heaviness. And it's not very subjective, so like 10 different people give 6 different definitions. It's like 499 out of 500 people use the exact same word, heaviness, heavy. And we all know as human beings what that means. We've all lifted things and been on roller coasters. So when we're all using the same word, that's a clear sign that there's something tangible to that term. Well, folks, what does the bending of space cause? Gravitational fields. And so the feeling of heaviness that these investigators report is literally true, because the gravitational effect is increasing as space-time bends in the vicinity that they're standing. So this is how gravity can relate to the paranormal. And what's so remarkable about this model is that it explains all these different phenomena in a uniform way. And not only that, it also explains how some of the mysteries that we have in the world at large, in the universe at large with gravity, could be explained. Why we can't find a graviton, why we can't find a Higgs boson, why we can't find dark matter. Because the space is being bent from outside of space-time. These particles are not necessary to create a gravitational field. And that's why we can't find them, because they're not there. And so this is how this theory begins to bridge all these things together. Now, the other two aspects of the theory has to do with the materialization of information within the curvatures of space-time. And then the third part is the mechanism by which that happens. So I'm going to take a breath break now and let you guys talk.
Oh yeah. One of the things. Go ahead, Jeff. Did you have something?
No, I was just impressed, and I was like, wow, to everything he was saying was just, it's you got to read his book. You realize this is a book that just about anybody in the paranormal field should read, because he as he says, he everything he explains. And what's really interesting is I'd be reading along, and Tom, you would have stuff like you'd be pointing out a certain point, and my mind, like you say, getting the ghost stuck in your head, I would say, well, what about this? And then he would address that in about 2 sentences. I'm like, how did he know I was thinking that way? And then he did that about 5 times. I can't even remember the examples, but I was like, wait a minute, how's he in my head? So you get where people, like you say, we think in boxes, and your book thinks outside that box and explains it in a way that makes sense, at least to people like me, certainly, that read this kind of stuff.
Well, what I've tried to do is to remove all preconceptions and just sit back and look at what everything is and just take it for what it looks like, and not just look at one little sliver of reality, but try to look at all of reality and make those connections. And when I understood about gravity, and when I was able to conceive of how this could relate, that was the key that unlocked the door. And then once that unlocked the door, everything just flooded, and it all started making sense. I've been on radio shows where the host was head of a paranormal investigation group. Had that several times. One of them, just you could hear the lady gasp, and she said, "You just described a luminous orb." I said, "Yes, I know I did." And then another lady said, "You know, if what you're talking about, this kind of a standing bubble that didn't have any materialized information in it, what you just described is what we call a spirit vortex." I said, "Yes, you're right." It all starts falling together.
Yeah.
One of the things, I guess, kind of like that I wanted to touch on, One of the things in your book is the challenge of scriptures. Now, how much of the Bible did you kind of relate to?
Well, what I tried to do was this. Being of a Christian background, of course, the Bible would have been and is the source of spiritual insight for myself.
Right.
But when I looked at it for what it actually said, get rid of some of the church traditions that have grown up over time, some of them that are very much like fairy tales, and look at the actual message, the actual wording that's in the scriptures and what it says.
Saying. Right.
What I discovered was a kind of an ancient cosmology, the way that the universe was put together, the way those ancients understood it as being. And I took that as a sincere or a real evidence of inspiration on their parts. And so I took that model that they were talking about and put it together and saw what kind of picture that it drew. And amazingly enough, what it did, it described to me not only pre-material or supermaterial, superphysical information, but also a superphysical substance that was a wave function. And that as these things became more intense, they would decelerate towards the speed of light. And as they crested the speed of light and moved below it, that time and space would bend in those places, and that those elements would begin to materialize in space-time as they drop below the speed of light.
Now, you talk about...
Oh, by the way, Thomas, I was going to say, Henry also has the tendency of psychically knowing when Craig and I were going to ask something specific, so he tends to ask it. I was actually going to bring up the religious aspects of the book, which I found fascinating, especially concepts of the Apocrypha, and now I have to go look up. But what's not ironic, but a little synchronistic about your being our guest tonight, considering your book, is the student film that I'm on my way right now to shooting is based on the parable of the Midnight Visitor from the book of Luke.
That's interesting.
I'm playing essentially the neighbor who gets woken out of a sound sleep. And when I was reading your book, I'm like, wow, this is the same night that I'm going to be filming that. It's the night he's going to be the guest on our show.
That sounds great. Hey, what I've always said is that coincidence is a term that we use to describe a phenomena for which we have no understanding.
Cool.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is a gateway to other dimensions. In the Bible, it talks about different things, and not just only the Bible, but there's other different books that's been written, like the lost books of the Bible and forgotten books of Eden. In 2 Chronicles, Paul was telling a story, and he said, I once knew a man, and whether he was from the third heaven or not, I could not tell. And he goes on and explains himself. And in the forgotten books of Eden, Enos also tells about the 12, I believe it's 12 levels of heaven. The church doesn't talk too much about that stuff. They kind of frown on that kind of, because they don't bring all that stuff out. But is that kind of like the different dimensions that you might say that there is that you can travel through or to or from?
Well, what we're talking about, again, we have to watch this word dimensions.
Right.
Because it's something that's been screwing us up for decades, because when we think of dimensions, we're thinking about something that's physical and trying to give these super physical elements these physical characteristics. And it definitely kind of, well, it's one of the things that's wrong with string theory. There's one version of string theory that expresses reality in 11 dimensions. And then there's the superstring theory that expresses it in 26 dimensions. But no one can explain how these dimensions are folded into space-time. They can't explain it, and they have to, because dimensions are something physical. It's one of the problems with string theory. And while I'm mentioning it, folks, a little-known secret is that the other problem with string theory is that it's all dependent on the existence of a graviton. If there is no graviton, string theory just disappears. It vaporizes. But yes, let me try to give an example again in a haunted house to see what we can derive from that. Let's say that we see an apparition, and well, it seems like in the United States we see a lot of 19th century Victorian ladies. So let's think about a 19th century Victorian lady. She lived 130 years ago or whatever. And then we see an apparition of her. There's no body, but clearly what we're seeing is detailed enough that all the information that made up the original person and their clothing and their features and all of that is somehow materializing in front of our eyes. But without the body, without the physical counterpart. And so what we can say about that is that information can not only be materialized and dematerialized in and out of the physical world, but that it's also traveled through time. Because that 19th century Victorian lady doesn't exist anymore. And yet the information about her living being is being materialized in front of our eyes. Now, if we go from a relativity point of view, from Einsteinian point of view, we would say that in our present time, seeing that information materialize, that we're getting direct transmission of information from the past into the present. But if we were going to go back 130 years ago to where the Victorian woman was alive and walking around, from her perspective, the information about her being is traveling to the future. And so there we have a way that, think about this. If we were able to master this technology, and if UFOs are intelligently controlled craft and designed craft, I believe that the makers of these things have discovered this technology. You could take an object, and if you collapse the space-time warp that surrounds it, it would disappear from our space and time. It would completely dematerialize. Yet every single bit of information that would be necessary to rematerialize that object at a different location would be preserved outside of space-time. It wouldn't be degradable because it's not material anymore. It wouldn't have to travel through time because the dimension of time is completely collapsed above the speed of light. And so it could reappear 130 years later or go back 130 years from the past.
So it'd be like a beam me up Scotty type thing?
Oh, absolutely. This would give us an idea. My book talks about teleportation and how this could be achieved without going through the physical impossibilities of trying to disassemble a physical body and somehow record the information about every piece and particle that's in it and then reassemble it elsewhere. The information about every component in that physical body already exists. It's only a matter of manipulating it.
Now, with time kind of scooting right on by, I do want to make sure that I recognize the people that's listening from around the world. We do have listeners in the UK, the US, Canada, and that one world called Other. We got 8 of those. So welcome everybody. And to those that are in the chat room, want to thank you for being here tonight and appreciate each and every one. If you're not with us, come on over to para-x.com. There's still lots of time left, so come on over and join us. You can interact with us and private message Craig or myself with questions. Getting right on down to it, UFOs. Are they real? Do they actually time travel like what you're saying?
It depends what you mean by real. Do they exist? Do unidentified flying objects exist? Yes, of course they do. The question is, what are they? And so for me, what I've always tried to do, I've tried to make a separation in this investigative field into, let's say, like criminology and forensics. And unfortunately, in our field, we have thousands of criminologists for every 0.5 forensists. Everything's in the hauntings, everything's got to do with the ghost. Who done it? In the UFOs, it's got all to do whether it's the Men in Black or Black Ops or, aliens, that type of thing. But that doesn't give us the answer as to how this stuff happens. It only gives us an answer of who's behind it. So for me, I don't speculate on whether there's little green men or little gray men running around spaceships. What I say is this: if they are intelligently controlled craft, then this model in my book explains every way that they behave, how they can do what they can do. Give you an idea. We see, let's assume for a minute that these are craft, that these are objects, okay? We see them travel through space at tremendous speeds with no visible means of propulsion, no force that is making this occur. Now that's funny. That sounds like a paranormal levitation. When I was talking to Paul Eno on his show Behind the Paranormal, and I'm going to be talking to him again on Monday, he tells me of an event that happened in the 70s during an investigation where a heavy TV actually flew off of a table and flew across the room and struck him in the leg. And it almost broke his leg. And he was wondering how that could happen. Well, it's the same kind of event where you have an object being propelled with no physical means present, no energy that's being generated, no device that can generate that energy or focus it in that way. It just flies across the room. And let me give you an example. If we have time, I want to talk about another kind of mental model.
We still got like 18 minutes.
Okay, great. Let's talk about a rubber membrane again. Let's imagine we have a large frame like a window, but we're going to lay it flat. Let's say it's a tabletop, like one of those shadow boxes, but laying down flat. And we stretch a rubber membrane across it. And again, we have the same idea, whereas on our side, when we're looking at the membrane, we're looking from the physical, from four-dimensional space and time. And on the other side, where we can't see, it's that other realm. Call it what you want, spirit realm, the other side. I call it supergeometric space, superphysical, whatever you want to call it. Let's take a large object like a baseball and place it on that rubber. And it's going to get a depression. It's going to sink into that fabric of space-time like we observe in the real world. Now, what if we wanted to move that? Let's think, for example, let's say if we took a feather and we tried to push it against the baseball, we're not going anywhere. You need something much more forceful than that. So let's say we take a stick and we push that baseball across that rubber. Now, we can see the stick. We can see the hand that's moving it. We can see all the energetic and physical mechanisms in the way that energy is generated and focused to move that ball. That's normal. In paranormal, the ball moves by itself without any of those physical forces and focus to make the ball move. So how would that be explained? Well, let's think about it for just a second. Let's imagine that there's an invisible hand on the other side of that fabric underneath, that rubber that we can't see. And let's say that somewhere in front of that ball, that hand comes up and pinches that rubber and pulls it down, creating a pocket of space-time from the superphysical realm. Well, what would happen? The ball would roll ahead all by itself with no visible means of propulsion. And that's exactly what happens in paranormal levitation. That's exactly what happens in UFOs.
So, any thought as to where the UFOs might come from?
That's the criminology unit. All I can tell you is from the forensic side, they could come from almost anywhere. It wouldn't be dependent on these weird material explanations like wormholes or other dimensions or that type of thing. If you were able to reduce what its physical presence is, this is what I call regular objects, hard objects have 100% physical presence. If you were able to reverse the polarity of whatever causes the space to bend around those objects, that object would recede. It would slowly become transparent. It would experience what we would call anti-gravity, because the less mass it has, the less gravitational effect it will be on it. It'll get transparent. It may float up in the air. It may actually move through solid walls without leaving an energetic mark on the surface. Sounds an awful lot like a ghost, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, if we were able to completely recede that, zero presence in the physical universe, the information that constructed that object would still be there. So, technically, a race that had mastered technology based on this supergeometric principle, this model of space-time, would be able to transport here from who knows where in the galaxy. As long as they know how to find that physical coordinate, their craft and everybody in it would disappear on their home planet and would suddenly materialize in our space. And they could blink in and out of existence. As these space-time bubbles are being fluctuated, they could change shape, as we see these things do. They almost look like they're phasing in and out of reality. They could travel at tremendous speeds, because if they were bending the space-time in front of them and pushing that bubble along, as I described, that craft would begin to fall into that depression, and then as the depression was moved forward, that ball, that ship would be crushed against the side of that pocket and would ride the edge of it like a surfer rides a wave. And it could achieve tremendous speeds. It could make right-angle turns without everybody inside getting crushed, because they're all sitting in their own relative bubble of space-time. There is no, there is no inertia inside there. It's a completely different relative zone of space-time than the surrounding space-time. So there isn't an experience of velocity inside the ship.
We got about, looks like 12 minutes, so actually we got about 10 minutes to chat time, I would say.
I got to plug my website now,
Yeah, that's what I'm leaving time for. So
all right.
we won't forget that.
All right. You got to pay the bills,
You got to pay the bills, yep. So how do we hear disembodied voices and those we don't hear, audible, but we catch on our recorders?
This is the wonderful thing that my theory does, it makes physical predictions that could be tested. Now think about it for a minute. We're talking about the fabric of space-time being bent, and that fabric can be configured according to the information that's placed inside of it. Now, let's say that information is coherent. Let's say, for an example, it's a spirit. And that spirit comprises of information that would determine its structure. And let's say that spirit, disembodied spirit, tried to talk, as we would when we're living. Well, what could be happening is that activity is actually vibrating the fabric of space-time. And as it vibrates, that fabric itself acts like a vocal cord. So what it can do is two things. It can agitate the air molecules and vibrate them at the frequency and an amplitude identical to a human voice. So we hear it, a disembodied voice. But sometimes we don't, and it gets picked up on a recorder. Well, remember what I was saying. When you bend the fabric of space-time, you get an electromagnetic field. So if you're fluctuating the fabric of space-time and oscillating that field to the right frequency and amplitude, you wouldn't hear that electromagnetic field in your ears, but the copper coils that were connected to the diaphragm of a recording mic would pick it up, and you would hear a voice where it wasn't audibly detectable.
Now, by doing that, something would have to be making that frequency and bending that to be able to say the words. So would that constitute a spirit, somebody from the dead or the other side, or ever how you want to look at it?
I would say that whatever that would be would certainly fall into the definition of what people call spirits.
So pretty much in order for that to happen, you would just about basically have to have a spirit to be able to do it to start with. It's not something that would just happen on its own.
That seems to be the most likely perpetrator, is an intelligent, coherent body of information that acts as a living organism, and that its information is volatile, it's dynamic, it moves according to the living activity that's in that collection of information.
Now, my feelings are, and I might get flack on this, but my feelings are that no one will ever catch a ghost.
You are correct. That's why I say that Bigfoot is probably not paranormal, because I think someday somebody's going to actually drag a physical body in. But nobody's ever going to drag the body of a shadow ghost into a lab. There is no body.
That's pretty good.
And with the shadow ghost, just to add something real quick, the surfaces that are created at the interaction between this expanding bubble and the surrounding material is a reflective type of a surface. And at a certain frequency of radiation, that surface would act like a black painted object that would absorb all the photons that are hitting it, just like if it was painted black. And that's how you get a shadow ghost. There's nothing inside of it. It's just that the surface absorbs all surrounding ambient light.
Now, we lost Jeff. I think he might have had to go because he was supposed to be going to do a shoot. So I know one of the things that you had in your book was what are some of the paranormal puzzles?
I'm not sure exactly what part of it you're referring to. I apologize.
Oh, well, I was thinking it was one of the chapters that you had. It was called the Paranormal Puzzles, and I was just
Enigma of the Paranormal.
Okay.
Yes, it's what we've basically been talking about. I talk primarily about the paranormal in that particular chapter.
Let's see, and you also had one called the Paranormal Bible.
Yes. This is where what I talked about was to try to weed through the spiritual connotations and the teachings that are derived from the supernatural events described in the Bible, so that we can be able to look at those supernatural events themselves. For example, when Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, according to my model, he didn't multiply a bunch of loaves and fishes. They were the exact same 5 loaves and 2 fishes, materialized in thousands of different geographic locations at a single coordinate in time. If you collapse the dimension of time, you could have multiple iterations of a particular material. And it doesn't violate the laws of conservation, where matter can neither be created nor destroyed, because it's all the exact same matter. Nothing is being created.
That's true. You've answered a lot of people's questions as far as you might say the paranormal. So our time is just kind of like run right on by. I do want to thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight.
It was my pleasure. Can I plug my site?
Yes, we're going to let you do that right now.
Okay, everything you need to know, all the related articles, description of the books, picture of me, and of course, most importantly, where to purchase the book, and to communicate with me, email me if you want, www.cosmicveil, that's spelled V-E-I-L, cosmicveil.com.
Jeff, he was disappeared into the mountains and he lost service.
Yeah, that's what it says. Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah, I just talked to him.
Hello. Sorry about that.
All right, we're glad you're back, at least for a few minutes anyway. So
Exactly. Well, I'm sorry. The signal started to cut out before I realized before I could say anything. It cut out completely as we came up into the hills.
yeah, and I didn't know whether they'd come to pick you up and you wasn't able to talk anymore. What happened? So
I had been picked up. I was actually driving for a while.
Okay. All right.
Are you in like a Prius or something? Because that's the quietest car I've ever heard in my life.
I don't know. I'll have to ask Michael what kind of car that is. But it was very nice, and we were driving, and it was more interesting because he had a GPS on his phone, and it was sending him in a route that was different than what I had printed out. So I had no idea where we were. And all of a sudden, the signal started to cut out. I'm like, oh no! And before I could say anything, the signal was gone. I was like, oh no!
Jeff, won't you go ahead and give out all of your sites and our sites and where everybody can get a hold of the Paranormal View and all that good stuff?
Oh yes. Well, my website is jeffgould.net, GEFFGOULD.net, and on it at /2011PNV.htm is my Paranormal View page, where I have links to each report of each show that we've done. In fact, tonight's show will be synopsized rather independently because I haven't been at a computer all night. And there will be a link to Thomas's website and to the page at which on his website you can order his book, and I really recommend that. You can also get your Paranormal View apparel at cafepress.com/realbadgershop, all one word. And, of course, you can find Paranormal View on Facebook. Just type in Paranormal View. There we are.
All right. And you can also go to the Paranormal View.
Exactly.com.
And you can also go here on ParaX, go to the Saturday shows, go to the Paranormal View, and you'll also be able to get all of our on-demand shows through there too also.
Now you got to go through that, Saturday shows, and then it comes up that way, so
right.
It's not quite.
Tom, stay on till after we get off, and we'll chat with you for a few minutes. So
Sure.
Make sure that you drop by next week. We will see everybody then. Till next week, this is Henry Foister.
Craig Rupp.
Jeffrey Gould.
And we'll see you next week, same time. So good
Night,
night.
everybody.